It was the kind of winter morning that made even the air feel heavy. The streets lay under a soft, icy blanket of frost, glistening under the weak, early sunlight that had only just begun to peek through the thick gray clouds. Every breath turned to mist, and the biting wind moved through the town like a whisper that carried with it the sharp edge of cold. Trees stood bare, their skeletal branches reaching out like silent sentinels, motionless under the weight of winter's grip. People moved quickly, heads bowed, hands tucked deep into pockets or wrapped tightly around steaming cups of coffee. Scarves covered faces, coats were buttoned up to the neck, and boots crunched against the frozen sidewalks. Everyone seemed to be focused on just one thing: getting indoors as fast as possible. In the middle of this cold chaos walked a little girl named Anaya. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with curious eyes that always seemed to notice things others missed. Today, she wore her bright red coat, the one her mother had gifted her last winter. It was thick, warm, and padded just enough to make her feel like she was wrapped in a hug. She loved that coat. It had large black buttons shaped like little bears, a furry hood that tickled her cheeks, and deep pockets where she always kept her gloves, a crumpled tissue, and a tiny notebook for her drawings. Anaya was on her way to school, her backpack bouncing lightly with each step. Her breath came out in little white clouds, and though her cheeks were pink from the cold, she didn't seem to mind. She walked slowly, not out of laziness, but because she liked to notice things: the way the frost had made lace patterns on car windows, how the sparrows huddled together on a ledge, how the ice crunched differently under each footstep. Winter, to her, wasn't something to rush through. It was something to be felt, experienced, and admired. Her school was a few blocks away, and usually, the walk was uneventful. But this morning felt different. The streets, though full of people, seemed quieter than usual. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was something else, something in the air that whispered that something meaningful was about to happen. As she passed by the corner of Maple and 3rd, near the old stone bench under the tall oak tree, she noticed a few pigeons pecking at the icy pavement. Behind them, sitting hunched and nearly motionless, was an elderly woman. Anaya's steps slowed. Something about the way the woman sat curled in on herself, arms wrapped tightly around her chest, head bowed, made her stop completely. The woman was dressed in thin, worn clothes, a faded brown sweater that looked stretched out and far too thin for this kind of cold, pants that were frayed at the edges, and shoes that looked like they had long since given up on keeping out the cold. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly blue, and her hands, bare and trembling, were clenched into fists inside her sleeves, as though trying to hold on to whatever warmth remained. Her body trembled visibly. No one else seemed to notice her. They passed by, heads down, hurrying past like she was just another shadow in the background of the city's cold morning routine. Anaya stood there for a moment, heart thudding gently in her chest. The cold bit at her face, but it wasn't the weather making her uneasy. It was the look of pain and quiet desperation in the woman's posture, an invisible cry that only someone with a tender heart could hear. She had been taught to be kind, of course, and had given coins to street musicians or helped her classmates when they dropped their books. But this was something different. This wasn't a moment to wait for someone else to act. This was her moment to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. Clutching her red coat tightly, she took one small step toward the woman. As Anaya approached the old woman, the sounds of the world around her began to fade. The rumble of passing cars, the clicking of hurried heels on pavement, the distant barking of a dog, all of it seemed to fall away, leaving only the soft crunch of her boots on the frozen ground and the steady pounding of her heart in her ears. She had never been this close to someone so fragile looking, someone who seemed like they might break under the weight of a single gust of wind. The woman didn't look up. She didn't even seem to register that someone was standing before her. Her body was curled in on itself, as if trying to protect her heart from the cold and the world alike. Her hair, long and streaked with silver, was tangled and hung like a curtain over her face. Her hands were still trembling, thin, veined hands that looked like they hadn't known warmth or comfort in a very long time. Anaya's small face twisted. With worry, she had seen people in need before, of course. On her way to school, she sometimes passed by shelters or saw people sitting with cardboard signs near grocery stores. But this woman was different. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't holding out a cup or a sign. She wasn't even looking up. It was as if she had stopped expecting help altogether. For a moment, Anaya felt frozen, not by the weather, but by uncertainty. What could she do? She was just a kid, after all. She didn't have money. She didn't have food. She didn't even have her phone on her. Her mother didn't let her carry one yet. But what she did have was the one thing keeping her warm, her red coat. She looked down at it. It was thick and heavy, and lined with soft fleece on the inside. Her mother had saved up to buy it last year, and Anaya remembered the excitement she felt when she first tried it on. It was her favorite thing she owned. It made her feel safe, protected, loved. But now, standing in front of someone who clearly had none of those things, it didn't feel right to keep it. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to unbutton the coat. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she managed. With each button she opened, the wind bit harder at her skin. She felt the chill creep in instantly, slicing through her sweater. Still, she didn't stop. When the coat was completely unbuttoned, she slipped her arms out of the sleeves and held it in her hands for a moment. It was warm, still carrying her body heat. Taking a deep breath, she stepped even closer. Gently, she leaned down and placed the coat over the woman's shoulders. The woman flinched, slightly surprised by the sudden contact, but didn't resist. Anaya adjusted it carefully, tucking the coat around the woman's thin frame the way her mother used to tuck blankets around her at bedtime. She reached up and pulled the hood over the woman's head, then stood there quietly, watching. For a long moment, the old woman didn't move. Then, slowly, her hands came up and clutched the front of the coat, holding it tightly against her chest. She finally looked up, and when her eyes met Anaya's, they were filled with something so deep, so raw, that it took the little girl's breath away. There were no words exchanged. None were needed. The woman's eyes shimmered with tears, and she gave the faintest nada gesture filled with more emotion than any sentence could ever hold. Gratitude, shock, and perhaps even a flicker of hope shone through her expression. Anaya gave a small smile. She didn't say, "You're welcome," or "It's okay." She just stood for a moment, heart full, and then turned to leave, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. Her coat was gone, but somehow, she felt warmer than ever. As she walked away, the woman pulled the coat even tighter around her, and for the first time that morning, she stopped shivering. Anaya walked away slowly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying to block out the cold that now settled harshly against her small frame. The wind seemed crueler without her coat, slipping under her sweater and prickling her skin with icy fingers. Yet, despite the chill, there was a strange warmth blossoming inside her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. It was the kind of warmth that didn't come from wool or fleece, but from something deeper, something gentler. It was the warmth of knowing she had done something right. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she did. She wanted to give the woman dignity, to let her accept the coat without feeling watched or pitied. This wasn't about charity or attention. It was about one human being, seeing another not as a problem, or a stranger to ignore, but as someone who mattered. Each step Anaya took was slower than the last, not from hesitation, but from the strange quiet that had settled over her thoughts. She wasn't sure why she had done what she did so instinctively. She just knew that leaving the woman there without her coat had felt wrong, deeply wrong, and even though she was now cold, even though she could feel the tips of her ears stinging and her fingers going numb, she didn't regret it. As she turned down the next street, her breath came out in short, misty clouds. The cold was starting to bite in earnest now, and she could feel her energy waning. Still, she pushed forward. The image of the old woman holding the coat tightly, eyes shining with unshed tears, stayed with her. It wasn't the kind of image that faded quickly. It was burned into her memory, one of those rare moments when a person realizes the power of a simple action, and how deeply it can touch another's soul. Meanwhile, back at the corner where the act of kindness had taken place, the elderly woman sat quietly, her hands gripping the coat like it was a lifeline. The warmth it offered was more than just physical. It carried with it something far more powerful. It carried care. It carried compassion. It carried the unexpected kindness of a child in a world that often looked the other way. For the first time, in what felt like weeks, the woman allowed herself to exhale fully. She had been surviving, barely, for days, sleeping on benches, hiding in bus stops, walking aimlessly to stay warm. She had grown used to being invisible. People rarely looked at her, let alone spoke to her. Some crossed the street to avoid her, others gave her the occasional coin, tossed with barely a glance. But this was different. She looked down at the coat again. It was too big for her frame, the sleeves falling past her wrists, but it was soft and heavy and warm. The hood, lined with a fur-like trim, rested lightly on her head. She could smell the faintest scent of lavender fabric softener and something sweet, perhaps cookies, or a child's shampoo. The scent made her eyes sting again, not from the cold this time, but from the flood of emotions rising within her. Who was that girl? Why had she done it? The woman didn't know her name, didn't know where she had come from, or where she was going. But she knew this. In that moment, something had changed. Not just the temperature of her body, but something inside her heart. The small act had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten, that there was still good in the world, that kindness still existed, that sometimes the purest forms of compassion came from the smallest hands. She pulled the coat tighter and leaned back gently against the bench. For the first time in many days, she closed her eyes, not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. She allowed herself to rest, safely wrapped in the warmth of a child's selflessness. Back on the street, Anaya trudged on, unaware that she had done far more than give away a coat. She had given someone a reason to believe again. While Anaya disappeared down the street, arms wrapped around herself, unaware of the quiet miracle she had just sparked, someone else remained rooted in place, not from cold, but from awe. A few yards away, standing just inside the doorway of a small tea shop, was an old man. His name was Eli, one of the elders from the nearby tribal community nestled just beyond the city's edge. He had come into town early that morning to pick up supplies: tea leaves, dried herbs, a few hand tools. He hadn't planned to linger, but when he glanced out the frosted window of the shop and caught sight of the little girl kneeling beside the old woman, something inside him urged him to stop and watch. Eli had lived a long life, rich with wisdom and full of both joy and hardship. As a respected elder in his tribe, he was known for telling stories that spanned generations, for reminding the young of their roots and the old of their worth. But even with all that he had seen over the years, droughts, storms, births, reunions, there was something about what he had just witnessed that stirred him in a way few things could. He had watched as the child approached the elder with no fear, no hesitation, no sense of superiority. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She didn't wait for encouragement. And most importantly, she didn't turn away, as so many others had done. Instead, she gave away what might have been the most valuable thing she had on her. In that moment, her own protection from the cold. Eli knew that kind of gesture wasn't learned from books or classrooms. It came from the soul. It came from the kind of upbringing that nourished empathy. And yet, it also came from within, a spark that no one could force, a light that chose to shine on its own. The moment the girl walked away, Eli stepped out of the tea shop and into the cold. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but he barely noticed the chill on his face. He looked at the old woman, who now sat cocooned in the red coat, her shoulders no longer hunched in pain, but relaxed ever so slightly. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slower, steadier. Eli could see how the coat, far too big for her now, looked like it belonged to her, as though it had found its rightful place. He stood there in silence for a long while, not wanting to intrude on the moment. The girl was gone, but her presence lingered like the last notes of a beautiful melody. Eli felt something shift inside him. In all his years of teaching others the importance of kindness, of generosity, of community, he hadn't expected to be taught something himself by a stranger, much less a child. Finally, he turned and began walking back toward the edge of town, where his tribe lived, near the forest line. With each step, his mind raced not in confusion, but in clarity. He needed to tell the others. This wasn't just a story to hold close to the heart, it was one to share, to honor, to pass on. In a world that often forgot its most vulnerable, this girl's silent act had reignited something sacred. By the time he reached the trail leading into the woods, the sun had climbed higher, casting pale gold light over the frozen ground. Eli walked faster now, energized. The tribe needed to hear what he had seen, not just because it was beautiful, but because it reminded them of who they were, and who they could still be. That morning, Anaya had unknowingly stitched herself into the fabric of a much larger story, one that she would not hear about for some time, and one that the tribe would never forget. She had reminded them that even the smallest among us can be powerful, that love, when given freely, is never wasted, and that sometimes it only takes one quiet act to awaken the hearts of many. By the time Eli reached the edge of the tribal village, the sun was beginning to melt the frost on the tree branches, leaving tiny droplets that sparkled like crystals. The path through the forest was quiet, peaceful, and familiar, a comforting return to the place where he had spent most of his life. Yet today, that familiar walk carried an unusual energy. The story burning inside him needed to be told. It pulsed through his veins, warming him more than the sunlight ever could. The tribe's village was modest wooden cabins, nestled beneath tall pines, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, and children's laughter occasionally ringing out through the air. It was a place where everyone knew each other by name, where wisdom was shared like fire, and kindness wasn't just valued, it was expected. But even in such a place, moments like the one Eli had witnessed were rare, and they were sacred. As he passed the first few homes, he paused to greet an elder weaving a basket on her porch and a group of teens preparing wood for the community fire. Each time, he said the same thing: call the others, gather at the circle, I have a story that must be shared. Word spread quickly. Within an hour, the heart of the village, the fire circle, was surrounded by people of all ages. Children sat cross-legged on the ground, their faces bright with curiosity. Adults stood quietly behind them, eyes alert, sensing that something special was about to unfold. The elders, seated in their carved wooden chairs around the flames, nodded with quiet reverence as Eli took his place at the center. He did not begin with a greeting, nor did he speak in the slow, deliberate tone he often used when telling old tales. This was not a story passed down through generations. This was something real, something immediate. This morning, he began, voice strong despite the chill. I saw a child do what many grown people would not. I saw a little girl, no more than 8 years old, give her own coat, the only one she had, to a woman sitting alone in the cold. There was a murmur among the listeners. Some looked at one another, eyebrows raised. Others leaned in, drawn to the raw emotion in Eli's words. She didn't do it for recognition, he continued. There were no cameras, no crowd, just her and the elder. The girl saw suffering, and without hesitation, she offered what she had. No fear, no pride, only compassion. He paused, letting the silence settle over the circle like snow. She was not one of us, he said gently. but today, she reminded us of who we are. That sentence hit home. Among this tribe, stories were not merely entertainment, they were mirrors. They reflected back the truths people sometimes forgot in the rush of everyday life. And Eli's story was doing just that. In a world where so many walked past pain and called it normal, the image of a child who gave without thinking spoke louder than any sermon ever could. One of the younger women, Myra, who worked with the village's elders, wiped her eyes. "Do you know her name?" she asked softly. Eli shook his head. "No." She walked away into the cold. "I doubt she even told anyone what she did." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a boy in the front row, no older than 6, raised his hand and asked, "What are we going to do about it?" And just like that, the silence was broken, not with noise, but with purpose. The elders exchanged knowing glances. A whisper of something old and sacred stirred in the air, like the first winds. Before a coming change, this wasn't just a story anymore, it was a call, a reminder, a seed. Eli smiled and nodded. "We honor her, we remember her, and we act. Because when someone lights a fire of kindness, we must not let it go out." The gathering ended not with applause, but with action. The people didn't return to their homes in silence. They left with a mission growing in their hearts. How to take that one small act and let it ripple. Let it grow. Let it become something even bigger. While Anaya disappeared down the street, arms wrapped around herself, unaware of the quiet miracle she had just sparked, someone else remained rooted in place, not from cold, but from awe. A few yards away, standing just inside the doorway of a small tea shop, was an old man. His name was Eli, one of the elders from the nearby tribal community nestled just beyond the city's edge. He had come into town early that morning to pick up supplies: tea leaves, dried herbs, a few hand tools. He hadn't planned to linger, but when he glanced out the frosted window of the shop and caught sight of the little girl kneeling beside the old woman, something inside him urged him to stop and watch. Eli had lived a long life, rich with wisdom and full of both joy and hardship. As a respected elder in his tribe, he was known for telling stories that spanned generations, for reminding the young of their roots and the old of their worth. But even with all that he had seen over the years, droughts, storms, births, reunions, there was something about what he had just witnessed that stirred him in a way few things could. He had watched as the child approached the elder with no fear, no hesitation, no sense of superiority. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She didn't wait for encouragement. And most importantly, she didn't turn away, as so many others had done. Instead, she gave away what might have been the most valuable thing she had on her. In that moment, her own protection from the cold. Eli knew that kind of gesture wasn't learned from books or classrooms. It came from the soul. It came from the kind of upbringing that nourished empathy. And yet, it also came from within, a spark that no one could force, a light that chose to shine on its own. The moment the girl walked away, Eli stepped out of the tea shop and into the cold. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but he barely noticed the chill on his face. He looked at the old woman, who now sat cocooned in the red coat, her shoulders no longer hunched in pain, but relaxed ever so slightly. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slower, steadier. Eli could see how the coat, far too big for her now, looked like it belonged to her, as though it had found its rightful place. He stood there in silence for a long while, not wanting to intrude on the moment. The girl was gone, but her presence lingered like the last notes of a beautiful melody. Eli felt something shift inside him. In all his years of teaching others the importance of kindness, of generosity, of community, he hadn't expected to be taught something himself by a stranger, much less a child. Finally, he turned and began walking back toward the edge of town, where his tribe lived, near the forest line. With each step, his mind raced not in confusion, but in clarity. He needed to tell the others. This wasn't just a story to hold close to the heart, it was one to share, to honor, to pass on. In a world that often forgot its most vulnerable, this girl's silent act had reignited something sacred. By the time he reached the trail leading into the woods, the sun had climbed higher, casting pale gold light over the frozen ground. Eli walked faster now, energized. The tribe needed to hear what he had seen, not just because it was beautiful, but because it reminded them of who they were, and who they could still be. That morning, Anaya had unknowingly stitched herself into the fabric of a much larger story, one that she would not hear about for some time, and one that the tribe would never forget. She had reminded them that even the smallest among us can be powerful, that love, when given freely, is never wasted, and that sometimes it only takes one quiet act to awaken the hearts of many. The days that followed were unlike any the tribe had experienced in recent memory. Word of the red-coated child began to spread, not just through their own village, but into neighboring communities, towns, and eventually, the city where Anaya lived. It started quietly. A visitor to the tribal village, passing through to trade herbs and winter supplies, heard Eli retelling the story at the fire circle. Moved by the tale, the visitor shared it at a community event back in town. Then a teacher mentioned it at her school. A local writer overheard the story and published a short blog post titled "The Girl Who Gave Her Warmth Away." Within days, the post was shared hundreds of times, then thousands. The internet did what it always did with stories that touched the heart. It gave them wings. People around the region, and even beyond, began to read about the nameless little girl who had given away her only coat to a freezing stranger without expecting anything in return. The lack of her name didn't matter. In fact, it somehow made the story more powerful. She was not doing it to go viral. She hadn't taken a photo. She hadn't even known anyone had seen her. And because of that, her act remained pure, by recognition fueled only by a genuine heart. As the story gained attention, people began writing to the tribe. They sent letters, emails, and even handmade cards addressed to the red-coated girl. Some wrote how the story reminded them of their childhood, when their grandmother had knitted them a scarf they gave to a stranger. Others shared how it inspired them to go through their closets and donate coats, gloves, and blankets to shelters in their area. One woman in a faraway city started a project called Share the Warmth in honor of the girl, setting up free winter clothing stands in public parks for the homeless. What it was as if a dormant empathy in people's hearts had been stirred awake. Back in the tribal village, the community watched this unfolding wave with quiet awe. They had not expected the story to travel so far, but they welcomed it not as a moment of fame, but as an opportunity to serve even more. The elders organized new donation drives. Children created artwork telling the story of the redcoat. Volunteers began stitching little red hearts and mailing them to those who had shared their own acts of kindness. Elsie Mae, ever the storyteller, was invited to speak at nearby schools and youth centers. He would sit before rooms full of children and speak gently of the day he saw a girl place a coat over a woman's shoulders with no expectation of reward. His voice, worn yet warm, painted the scene so vividly that even the most restless kids would fall into a hush, their eyes wide and hearts open, and all the while, Anaya remained unaware of the quiet storm of kindness she had started. Her family had noticed, of course, that she had come home without her coat that day. Her mother had been surprised, a little concerned, but when Anaya had softly explained what happened, her mother had only paused for a moment, looked into her daughter's eyes, and then pulled her into a long, tearful hug. "I'm proud of you," she had whispered. "So proud. We'll get you another coat." But what you gave her, that was priceless. Anaya hadn't asked for another coat right away. For a week, she wore layers of sweaters and an old jacket her cousin had outgrown. She never complained. She simply said, "It's okay. Someone else is warm now." But the world didn't forget. One morning, just over a week later, a box arrived at Anaya's school. Inside was a beautifully handmade red coat, stitched with care and lined with warm fleece. On the left sleeve, near the cuff, was a tiny embroidered heart in red thread. Along with the coat was a simple note, for the girl who reminded the world what warmth really means. Anaya smiled as she held it up. She didn't know who had sent it, but in that moment, she realized something magical. Kindness always finds its way back even when you're not looking for it. As the final snow of the season gently fell, blanketing the world in soft silence, Anaya walked through her neighborhood wrapped in her new red coat, the one with the little heart stitched into the sleeve. It fit her perfectly. But more than that, it felt like it belonged to her, as though it had been made not just for her body, but for her story. With every step she took, she was unaware that people across cities, villages, and countries now recognized the symbol of the red heart. What had started as a quiet gesture on a cold morning had become a living movement, one that transcended place, age, and even language. Though Anaya was still just a child, her one act had rippled into something vast and beautiful. Around the world, children and adults alike were sewing red hearts into their coats. They were handing them out to those in need, placing them on community coat racks, and offering warmth where it was needed most. In some towns, little wooden boxes labeled Red Heart Closet began to appear, places where people could donate or take winter gear freely, no questions asked. These boxers bore small plaques, each one engraved with a line inspired by the original act. Kindness is never wasted. It multiplies. News stories continued to circulate, but none of them had the girl's full name. Some tried to track her down, hoping to get an interview or a photo, but no one in the tribe gave her away. They said only what mattered. She is real, and she reminded us what it means to care. Anaya herself didn't crave the spotlight. She still walked to school the same way. She still watched the frost on windows, listened to birds, and helped her classmates when they dropped their books. If anyone mentioned the girl with the red coat, she would just smile gently and change the subject. It wasn't that she was shy, it was just that, in her heart, she believed kindness wasn't something you did to be seen, it was something you did because it was right. Back in the tribal village, the Heart of Humanity Award became an annual tradition. Every winter, a quiet ceremony took place around the fire. Children would gather in coats patched with red hearts, and elders would retell the story of the red-coated child. They told it not as legend, but as a living truth. The point wasn't to celebrate the past, it was to inspire the present. To remind everyone that compassion didn't require wealth, age, or power. It required only a moment of courage and the willingness to see someone else as human. Elsie growing older but still, sharp and kind, continued to be the story's keeper. He would sit by the fire with young children at his feet, and with a voice full of memories say, "She taught us without speaking, she saw need, and gave. That's all, and yet that's everything." The elderly woman who had received Anaya's coat, she was never forgotten. With the warmth of that coat and the support that followed, she found shelter through a local outreach group, one of many inspired by the story. Slowly, her life began to rebuild. She began volunteering herself, helping others who were where she once had been. She often wore the red coat, still, even when she no longer needed it, because to her, it was more than fabric. It was proof that someone once had seen her when no one else had. Seasons passed, but the story of the red coat lived on, not in headlines, but in hearts. On every city where someone placed a scarf on a stranger's shoulders. In every school where children were taught that kindness matters more than praise. In every home where a parent told their child, "Let me tell you a story." Anaya's spirit lived on. Because, sometimes, the simplest act can echo through the world like a song that never ends. One red coat. One small girl. One small girl. One unspoken promise. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are loved, and that, in the end, is all the warmth the world truly needs.